Hello everyone, and welcome back to Lunar History. Tonight, I invite you to leave behind the modern world for a little while and step with me into the cold, cooling corridors of a medieval castle. Let's imagine heavy wooden doors groaning shut behind you, the torchlight flickering against ancient stone walls, and the faint whistle of winter wind slipping through cracks that no mason could ever fully seal. It is a place that feels magical when you visit today. But if you had to live here, especially through the bitter months of the year, you would quickly discover that these fortresses were not built for comfort. They were built to endure sieges, to protect wealth and power, but never to keep their residents warm. That is the paradox we are going to explore tonight. How people in the Middle Ages managed to sleep in such unforgiving environments without freezing to death. Before we dive into this story of survival, adaptation, and ingenuity, I'd love for you to take a moment to support the channel. If you enjoy learning about the strange realities of history, where daily life was as much about resilience as it was about tradition, then please hit that like button. And if you'd like to join me again on future journeys into the past, where we uncover not just the grand battles and kings, but the intimate details of how people truly lived. Don't forget to subscribe. Every like, every comment, every subscription helps me continue to bring you these long-form explorations of history, made for relaxing evenings and curious minds alike. Now, let's set the scene more vividly. Picture yourself preparing for bed in one of these castles. The air is sharp and heavy with dampness. You can see your breath clouding in front of you, even indoors. The fire in the great hall has burned low, and the warmth you carried with you while sitting beside it begins to slip away as soon as you climb the stairs to your chamber. By the time you push aside the heavy curtain that hides your bed, your fingers sting with cold. Survival in these conditions required more than a blanket or two. It required strategy, ritual, and sometimes even the help of companions, both human and animal. But what fascinates me most about this story is not just the hardships themselves, but how people found small victories against them with clever tricks like layered bedding, thick curtains, warming pans filled with glowing coals, and even the comfort of sleeping close to family or loyal dogs. They carved out moments of warmth where none should have been possible. To sleep in a medieval castle was not to surrender to the night, but to fight a quiet battle against it. So tonight, as we unfold this tale layer by layer, I encourage you to dim your lights, settle into your own warm and comfortable bed, and let yourself imagine what it was like to live in a world where every night was a test of endurance. The deeper you imagine yourself wandering through one of these imposing fortresses, the clearer it becomes that behind the grandeur of towers and battlements lay a reality far less romantic than the images we often carry in our minds. For while castles were designed to inspire awe and provide security against enemy attack, their interiors offered little in the way of comfort. In winter, turned them into places of endurance rather than luxury. The stone walls, which from the outside looked like unshakable guardians, paved like giant slabs of ice once the sun set, radiating chill into every chamber and swallowing any trace of warmth that dared to linger. It is almost as though the entire building was conspiring against its inhabitants, forcing them to fight a nightly battle, simply to rest. Walking across the vast rooms, you would notice how the air never seemed still, how currents of cold swept under doors and through narrow windows, and how no matter how many fires were lit in the great hall, the warmth rarely spread further than a few steps from the hearth. Imagine a feast ending late at night, the logs burned down to glowing embers, laughter fading into silence, and then that inevitable moment when you left the golden glow of the fire to climb the stairs toward your chamber, each step pulling you back into the grip of stone that refused to let heat survive. The corridors would echo with your footsteps, but around you, the air would feel as sharp as the outdoors, your breath visible, your skin already tightening against the bitter chill. Inside the chambers, life was no easier. Beds stood tall, not just for grandeur, but to rise above the coldest layers of air near the floor. And yet even high frames could not save sleepers from the icy embrace of the walls pressing in on all sides. The cold was relentless, not a brief discomfort, but a presence that shaped nightly rituals, dictating how people dressed, how they arranged their rooms, and even how they thought about survival itself. Records from travelers in noble households tell us that frost on the inside of windows and thin layers of ice in water basins were common sights. It's almost so ordinary that they were barely remarked upon, which gives us a sense of just how normal it was to live with temperatures we would today consider unthinkable for indoor life. The irony is striking when we consider the contrast between peasants and nobles, because while we might assume the wealthy enjoyed greater comfort, the truth was often the opposite. Peasant cottages, built of wood and clay with low roofs and small hearths, could sometimes retain heat more effectively than the vast, echoing chambers of a castle. A single fire in a modest home might warm an entire room, while a noble family, surrounded by luxury, could find themselves shivering beneath heaps of blankets as the cold seeped endlessly through thick stone walls. So when we picture these grand fortresses, it is worth remembering that they were never cozy havens, but places where every night became a test, where the choice of bedding, the thickness of curtains, the presence of companions, and even the warmth of a loyal dog at one's feet might spell the difference between restful sleep and hours spent shivering in the dark. And yet, what made these fortresses seem so mighty from the outside was exactly what condemned those inside to a life of constant shivering. For the very thickness of the walls that could shrug off arrows, stones, and even the pounding of a battering ram also acted as a prison. For the cold turning each chamber into something more like a vast stone refrigerator than a welcoming home. The masonry, piled layer upon layer with no thought for insulation, absorbed the winter air during the day and released it slowly throughout the night. Instead, even when a fire roared in the hearth, the warmth remained stubbornly local, a fragile circle of heat in an ocean of chill. Step just a few paces away and the air pressed against your skin with a damp, heavy weight, seeping through boots, gloves, and cloaks until every movement reminded you of how impossible it was to banish the cold entirely. Travelers often remarked that stone seemed to have its own memory, storing not just the temperature of the season, but the very character of dampness itself. And when you touched the wall in the depth of winter, it felt as if the earth's frost had been locked inside it forever. The moisture condensed on the surface ran down in streaks and left patches of darkness that never dried, so that the inside of a castle could feel more like a cave than a dwelling fit for nobility. Imagine lying in bed while droplets of icy water tapped rhythmically onto the floor, their sound echoing in the stillness of the night. A reminder that the fortress which was meant to shelter you was also betraying you. Accounts from chroniclers describe the eerie effect of seeing one's breath hang in the air indoors, or of waking to find frost tracing delicate patterns on bed curtains, as though nature itself had crept past the battlements to leave its mark on the lives of those within. Even tapestries, those ornate decorations that line the walls, could do little more than disguise the damp while the cold pressed relentlessly through. And though they may have softened the echo of cavernous rooms, they could never truly hold back the draft that slithered through cracks in shutters and arrow slits. What is most striking is the paradox that the strongest walls ever built by medieval hands were formidable against men but powerless against the weather. Every detail of castle life was shaped by this reality, from the arrangement of sleeping spaces to the layers of clothing worn long after the day had ended. To survive in such conditions was not about conquering the cold, but about learning to live within it, crafting small rituals and comforts that might make the night bearable. And as you imagine yourself settling down inside this fortress of stone, it becomes clear that the enemy outside may have been visible and fleeting, but the enemy inside, the deep, unshakable chill, was constant, waiting each evening to remind you of the price paid for living behind such mighty walls. No matter how vast the fireplace or how high the flames reached, the truth of life inside a castle was that the heat rarely traveled far, and Those who gathered close to the hearth knew that they were enjoying a fleeting gift that disappeared the moment they stepped away. The fire blazed and roared, its light painting the stone walls in flickers of gold, but beyond a narrow circle, the air remained heavy with dampness, and the breath of anyone sitting even a few paces back still clouded in the cold. Imagine yourself edging closer, stretching your hands out until they nearly cinch, cheeks glowing hot from the crackling logs, while your back prickles with the icy reminder that the rest of the chamber has not changed at all. The very design of medieval fireplaces betrayed their promise, for their chimneys were wide and unrefined, pulling smoke, and with it the precious warmth straight upward into the night sky, leaving the great room below lit by flames but barely softened against the bite of winter. Guests sometimes joked in letters that a noble fire was grand enough to roast an ox, but too weak to warm a man, and while their exaggerations may raise a smile, they also capture the irony of these mighty halls, for every cart of timber consumed seemed to vanish in a puff of smoke, leaving behind only soot, sparks, and the illusion of comfort. Servants hauled endless loads of wood to keep the flames alive, entire forests sacrificed in the name of survival. Yet the glow they created was little more than an oasis, bright but small, fragile, against the expanse of stone that swallowed sound and heat alike. Key. If you remained by the fire until your eyelids grew heavy, you faced a cruel moment once you rose to retire, because every step away was a step back into the grip of the castle itself, where drafts lurked in corners, and the walls radiated their own memory of cold. There was a strange rhythm to this existence, for the fire became not just a source of heat, but a ritual of gathering, a place where voices, stories, and songs tried to mask the truth that everyone knew: the warmth would not last, and soon they would climb stairs or slip into chambers where the cold reclaimed its rule. Even the most powerful lords and ladies were bound by this limitation, wrapping themselves in layer after layer once they left the circle of flames, their grandeur humbled by the same physics that peasants faced in their cottages. And so the fireplace stood as both a symbol and a deception. It's magnificent to look at, necessary for life, yet always inadequate, its comfort lasting only as long as you stayed within its glow, reminding every soul in the castle that fire was not salvation, but merely a brief reprieve before the night took hold again. When people think of life in a medieval castle, they often imagine the great hall as a place of comfort, with roaring fires, long feasts, and the warmth of companionship filling the air. Yet the truth was that while this immense chamber might have been the warmest part of the fortress, its heat was as temporary as the gatherings that sustained it, vanishing almost the instant the fires burned low. The hall came alive in the evening, its trestle tables lined with guests, the hearth blazing in defiance of the winter night, and the air thick with the scent of roasted meat, smoke, and spilt ale. But as long as voices rang and bodies pressed close together, the illusion of warmth held. Once the feast ended, however, the reality revealed itself with merciless speed, for no matter how many logs were thrown onto the flames, the moment they collapsed into embers, the cavernous space reverted to its natural state, a chamber of stone that clung to the cold and echoed with silence. Imagine the feeling of sitting at the end of a long evening, reluctant to leave the glow of the hearth, your cheeks hot and flushed from the fire, even as back of your body already sensed a chill creeping in from the shadows, the laughter, fading servants, extinguishing torches one by one, and the golden light shrinking until it seemed fragile and small against the enormity of the hall. Within an hour, the warmth dissolved, the smoke lingered like a ghost, and the vast chamber became colder than ever, as though it resented the intrusion of human comfort and reclaimed its dominion the moment people withdrew. Many travelers and chroniclers remarked that the transition from the hall to private chambers was the hardest part of the night, not the cold in bed itself, but that sudden plunge from fleeting comfort into biting air, like stepping from summer into winter in the space of a few steps. It was not uncommon for nobles to linger until the last moment, some even dozing in high-backed chairs near the embers, unwilling to face the cruel walk through staircases and corridors where drafts howled, because once they left the hall, they knew their chambers would feel like tombs of ice. Even guards and servants often chose to collapse beside the fire, risking smoke, sparks, and restless sleep rather than surrender to the merciless chill waiting above. The Great Hall, then, was more than a room. It was a ritual of survival. It offered a gathering of heat before surrendering to the night, a reminder of what warmth felt like before the cold reclaimed its throne. To sit by its fire was to enjoy a fleeting truce, to believe for a short while that the fortress could be conquered by light and laughter. But the truth was always waiting just beyond the circle of flames. In the end, the hall was not a sanctuary from the winter, but a brief pause, a fragile island of heat and life, surrounded by walls that remembered the cold far more faithfully than they ever held the warmth. What made the cold inside these castles feel so merciless was not only the stone that clung to winter's memory, nor the fireplaces that surrendered warmth too quickly, but the constant assault of invisible currents of air that slipped through every crack, shutter, and arrow slit, transforming each chamber into a battlefield where the wind itself was the enemy. It was never still, never quiet, and as you tried to settle for the night, you would feel it slide along your skin like an icy hand, finding the smallest opening and exploiting it with relentless persistence. The architects who built these fortresses gave careful thought to defense, to moats and drawbridges, to battlements that could deflect arrows and stones. But they rarely considered insulation, and so the very features that made the castle strong against armies also made it weak against the elements. Imagine yourself standing in a corridor late at night, the torches guttering against the draft as though the castle itself was sighing with the breath of the outside world. You draw your cloak tighter, but the cold still slips in beneath the edges, swirling around your boots, tugging at your sleeves, and whistling faintly through the gaps and shutters that creak on their hinges. Arrow slits, meant to provide defense in battle, turn into funnels of winter air once darkness falls, and no tapestry or curtain can fully silence their song. Some chroniclers wrote that the sound of the wind in a castle was like a living presence, moaning along the stone walls, rattling doors, and seeping through every space where wood met stone, as if the fortress were constantly reminding its inhabitants that nature could not be locked out. Inside the chambers, the effect was even harsher, because no matter how carefully bed curtains were drawn, the drafts always found their way through, extinguishing candles, chilling fingers, and turning sleep into a restless battle against the unseen currents. People stuffed cracks with rags, moss, or clay. Servants pressed shutters with bars. And yet, the wind persisted, a reminder that the cold was never simply outside, but always pressing inward, to lie awake and hear the hiss of air slipping through the joints of a door to feel your out. Blankets lift slightly, as if a ghost passed over them, was to know that you were never entirely safe from the bite of winter, no matter how thick the walls around you. What makes this detail so haunting is how ordinary it became for those who lived in castles. Drafts were not treated as surprises, but as facts of life, except with weary resignation, encountered only with layers of cloth and the shared warmth of others. And so the mighty fortress, proud and imposing from the outside, revealed its greatest weakness each night, when the wind crept freely through its defenses, turning rooms into caverns and reminding all who lived there that even the strongest walls could never silence the breath of the world beyond. As harsh as the drafts were, they were only part of the ordeal, for the cold in these fortresses did not simply sneak in through cracks or whisper through arrow slits. It often settled so deeply into the stone that entire chambers seemed to freeze from within, leaving behind scenes that to modern eyes would look surreal. There are accounts from travelers and residents alike who described waking to discover frost tracing delicate white patterns along the inner walls, as though the night had painted the chamber with its own hand. And in the bitterest months, it was not unusual for basins of water left overnight to be found with a sheet of ice crusted across the surface, solid enough to crack under touch. to lie in bed beneath heavy layers of wool and fur, draw the curtains of a great canopy close, and still see your own breath mint in front of you was a humbling reminder that castles were never meant to be warm. Imagine the shock of pulling back a bed curtain in the morning and finding icicles clinging to the fabric where condensation had frozen during the night, or of stepping onto the rushes strewn across the floor and feeling them crunch not only from wear but from the frost that had crept into the very fibers. These sights were not treated as disasters in their time. They were barely worthy of comment. It's ordinary that chroniclers often recorded them in passing as if it were no more unusual than rain falling or leaves turning in autumn. That casual acceptance tells us how constant and inescapable the cold was, and how survival meant learning to live alongside it rather than trying to resist it. Picture yourself lying awake in such a chamber. The walls slick with condensation that has turned brittle with frost. The faint glow of a dying ember throwing shadows across crystalline streaks, and every breath feeling sharp as glass. Even wrapped in multiple layers, with furs pressing down so heavily that movement is almost impossible. Your toes and fingers ache as though the night itself is gnawing at them. The silence is broken only by the drip of ice beginning to thaw near the hearth, or the groan of rafters strained under snow. And in that silence, you realize that the most formidable fortress ever built against men was fragile against the quiet persistence of winter. What makes this image so haunting is how it strips away the illusions we sometimes hold about noble life in the Middle Ages. The grand chambers, the carved beds, the ornate tapestries, all of them diminished when the temperature inside dropped low enough to freeze water and turn fabric stiff with ice. Nobles and peasants alike knew that winter did not respect rank, and while wealth provided heavier blankets or imported furs, it could not prevent a thin layer of frost from forming on the very walls of a lord's chamber. In the end, survival in such conditions was not about defeating the cold, but about enduring it night after night. And those moments of frost inside the bedchamber remind us that even in the heart of power, nature was always the truest master. Yet perhaps the greatest irony of all lay in the contrast between the mighty halls of the nobility and the humble cottages of the peasants. For while one might assume that wealth and status guaranteed warmth, the truth was that the poorest homes, built of timber, wattle, and daub, often held heat far better than the grandest towers of stone. A cottage was small, low-roofed, and centered around a single hearth, its walls packed with clay and straw that trapped warmth in a way no castle could match. When a fire burned in the middle of such a dwelling, the smoke curled into the thatch above and lingered in the rafters, creating a dense, smoky atmosphere that may not have been pleasant to breathe, but that wrapped the family in a cocoon of retained heat. The animals, often stabled in one end of the house, gave off their own warmth, adding another layer of insulation, so that a family huddled together near the fire might sleep in an environment far less brutal than the vast stone chambers of their lords. Imagine the difference on a January night, a noble wrapped in furs and buried beneath heavy blankets in a bed hung with embroidered curtains, still seeing his breath mist against the dark as frost formed on the inside of his windows, while down in the village a peasant family, though clad in rough wool and patched linens, sat in a cottage so compact that every ember from the hearth touched the air around them. Children curled against parents, grandparents tucked nearby, and the warmth of bodies mingled with the smoke and animal musk to create a closeness that may have lacked grandeur, but offered genuine relief from the cold. Contemporary observers sometimes noted this with surprise, remarking that the so-called mean huts of villagers seemed to keep their occupants more comfortable than the lofty rooms of a castle. And these comments strip away the illusion that luxury always meant ease. The irony was not lost on those who lived it. Letters survive from visiting clerics and nobles complaining of sleepless nights and icy chambers, advising future travelers to pack extra cloaks, while the peasants, accustomed to their smoky homes, endured winters with fewer such complaints. To be sure, peasant life was hard in countless other ways: scarcity of food, exposure to disease, the weight of endless labor. But when it came to the simple question of warmth on a winter night, their cottages often provided a kind of efficiency that stone fortresses could never match. Contrast reminds us that architecture shaped experience as much as wealth did. The grandeur of a castle was impressive to behold, but hostile to live in, while the cramped, earthy simplicity of a hut provided the sort of concentrated warmth that could mean survival. And so, when we imagine the hierarchy of medieval life, it is worth pausing to see how, in the most basic struggle against the cold, the lowborn sometimes fared better than their lords, proving that comfort was not always found where status suggested it should be, but where necessity forced people to create it. Comfort, then, did not come from architecture alone, but from the intimate choices people made each day. And one of the most essential defenses against the relentless cold of medieval life was clothing itself. For without the science of insulation or the convenience of modern heating, warmth had to be carried on the body in the form of carefully layered fabrics, built up like armor against the air that seeped into every corner of stone chambers and cottages alike. Wool was the most common and reliable of these layers, spun thick and woven into tunics, cloaks, and blankets. Its coarse texture, both durable and insulating, while linen, though lighter, provided the breathable base against the skin, absorbing sweat and allowing people to wear heavier outer layers without discomfort. Over these came furs, prized not only for their status, but for their undeniable power to trap heat, with fox, rabbit, sheepskin, and in the case of the wealthy, ermine or sable, serving as shields against the season's most bitter nights. Let's picture a noble dressing for bed on a January evening, not slipping into silken nightwear, as our imagination might like to suggest, but instead layering shirt over shirt, pulling on woolen hose, wrapping a cloak or two around the shoulders, and finally burying themselves beneath a mountain of pelts so heavy that turning in the night was nearly impossible. Even in these uncomfortable conditions, the chill often crept in, numbing toes and fingers until they were wrapped in extra strips of cloth. Servants knew this ritual, and though their garments were humbler, they followed the same principle, for the human body alone could not withstand the cold of an unheated chamber without layers upon layers to trap the fragile heat it produced. The act of layering became more than simple necessity. It was a cultural rhythm, a nightly preparation that shaped routines as much as the lighting of fires or the drawing of bed curtains. Children were swaddled in woolen wraps, elders bundled into cloaks, even indoors. And travelers wrote of arriving at castles only to be astonished at the sight of men and women alike, wrapped in garments so thick they resembled bundles rather than figures. Wealth, of course, dictated the quality and beauty of these fabrics, yet, in the end, whether a tunic was finely embroidered or crudely stitched mattered far less than the warmth it could preserve. This reliance on textiles also blurred the boundaries between fashion and survival. Bright dyes and careful tailoring made garments objects of pride. But beneath every display of color lay the same fundamental truth: without enough layers, the night would be unbearable. The struggle against the cold wove itself into every seam, every stitch, every choice of fabric, until clothing itself became not just expression, but protection. It's an intimate defense against a world where the cold was as constant as the walls of stone that surrounded them. Another subtle but ingenious adaptation to the chill of castle life could be found in the very design of beds, for they were not placed low to the floor as many of us might imagine today, but raised high upon sturdy frames, a deliberate choice meant to escape the coldest layers of air that gathered nearest the ground. Anyone who has ever lived in a drafty house knows that the floor is where the night feels sharpest, where every crack allows icy currents to crawl and settle. And medieval people, without understanding the science of air circulation in modern terms, nonetheless recognized through experience that the higher you slept, the warmer you might remain. Thus, noble beds often rose so tall that steps or stools were needed to climb into them, the act of retiring for the night, becoming a kind of ascent into a space that promised at least some relief from the worst of the cold below. To imagine this properly, picture a chamber where the rushes on the floor are brittle with frost and where a candle's flame wavers as unseen drafts move across the stone. Yet above it all stands a towering bed, its wooden frame carved with ornate patterns, its posts heavy with fabric, and its canopy draped like a shelter within a shelter. Climbing into such a bed was not simply about comfort, but about survival. For once enclosed within the curtains and buried under layer upon layer of wool and fur, the sleeper occupied a warmer pocket of air, one carefully created by height and insulation together. Though not entirely free from the castle's persistent chill, the difference could be enough to make the night bearable. The practice was not limited to nobility alone. Even humbler households elevated their sleeping spaces when possible, if only with wooden frames that lifted straw mattresses a foot or two above the floor. The poor may not have had carved posts or embroidered curtains, but the principle was the same. Keep away from the coldest layer of air. Create a little height and use whatever coverings could be spared to build a cocoon of warmth. In cottages, this often combined with the shared heat of family members lying close together, their bodies adding another layer of insulation to the modest protection of a raised pallet. For the wealthy, however, the bed became both a symbol of status and a fortress within a fortress. To lie above the floor was not just to avoid the cold, but to assert a small dominion over it, to craft a personal sanctuary against the stone's relentless grip. Servants might prepare the bed with warming pans of coals before their master retired, or hang additional curtains to keep the drafts from creeping in, transforming the raised structure into something that was part furniture, part survival chamber. This habit of elevation reminds us how deeply practical needs shaped daily life, even within the trappings of grandeur. No matter how richly adorned a bed might appear at its core, its purpose was simple: to lift its occupant away from the coldest breath of the earth and into a slightly more forgiving layer of air, where, for a few hours at least, rest could be stolen back from the winter that ruled the walls outside. Beyond the height of the bed itself, another ingenious adaptation emerged in the form of the great four-poster canopy, a structure that was more than a statement of wealth or taste for it, acted as a private fortress against the cold, transforming the act of sleep into an almost architectural ritual of survival. Heavy curtains, sometimes of wool, sometimes of richly embroidered velvet, were drawn tightly around the frame each night, enclosing the sleeper in a small chamber within the chamber, a cocoon where body heat, the warmth of furs, and the faint glow of a nearby fire combined to create a fragile but precious microclimate. It is easy to imagine the difference. Outside the curtains, the castle breathed with drafts, the air sharp and restless. Yet, within the canopy, the space grew warmer, stiller, and more intimate, as though one had carved out a pocket of safety in defiance of the season pressing against the stone walls. Picture yourself climbing into such a bed after a long evening by the hearth, ascending the steps to reach the mattress raised high off the ground, and then drawing the curtains closed until the outer world disappeared. The sounds of the castle muffled, the flicker of torchlight dimmed, and the thin current of air that had slipped through cracks and shutters was suddenly cut off. Inside this fabric-walled sanctuary, the body's own heat began to accumulate, turning the space into a shelter that could hold the night at bay. The warmth was not absolute frost, still traced the windows. The walls still radiated their ancient chill, but within the canopy, it was enough to ease aching bones and let exhaustion give way to sleep. For the nobility, these beds became more than a practical solution. They were symbols of power and privacy. The elaborate carvings on the posts, the rich dyes and patterns of the curtains, the delicate embroidery stitched into the canopy above were marks of status, yet beneath the artistry lay a simple truth. The purpose of this magnificence was survival. Even the wealthiest lords and ladies relied on the same principle as the humblest villager, with a rough woolen blanket pulled over their heads to trap every ounce of heat possible and shield themselves from the cold. The canopy bed also carried with it an intimacy that shaped social life. In some households, servants shared the bed to provide warmth to their masters, or family members curled together inside the enclosed space, their combined body heat reinforcing the barrier against the night. The curtains created not only warmth, but privacy, a world apart within the larger, drafty chamber, where secrets might be whispered and where the cold beyond could be forgotten for a time. Thus, these grand beds were not merely furnishings, but tools of endurance, clever constructions that turned the bleak reality of a castle's icy walls into a tolerable environment. They remind us that medieval survival was as much about ingenuity as it was about endurance, and that even in the most inhospitable settings, people learned to craft islands of warmth where rest and dreams could still exist. Yet, even within these enclosed sanctuaries, the quality of sleep was shaped not only by the height of the bed or the weight of its curtains, but by what lay beneath the sleeper, and here the contrast between rich and poor became strikingly clear. For while the humbler classes rested upon straw mattresses that crackled and shifted with every movement, the wealthy sank into feather beds that promised a softness rare in the medieval world. Straw was the common choice, gathered from fields after harvest, stuffed into sacks of coarse linen or rough canvas, spread across wooden frames or simple pallets. It was warm when freshly filled, carrying with it the faint scent of the fields, but it quickly flattened under the weight of bodies and turned brittle, needing regular replacement lest it harbor pests or become so compacted that it provided little more than a thin barrier against the hardness of wood. To lie upon it was to accept its shortcomings, the uneven surface poking and scratching, the straw whispering with every shift. And yet, for countless peasants, it was still far preferable to the cold floor. The nobility, however, lived with another reality, for their wealth allowed them to commission feather beds, sacks of down and plumage that yielded with every movement, creating an illusion of floating in warmth. To sink into such a bed after a day spent in the chill of stone corridors was to enter another world, where the body was embraced not by rigid straw, but by a softness that molded to every contour. These beds, often layered with sheets of fine linen and topped with fur coverlets, are symbols of privilege as much as they were tools of comfort, their very existence a reminder of the stark divisions that shaped medieval life. Servants who carried and prepared these beds rarely experienced such luxury themselves, but they could not have failed to notice the difference as they smoothed the down or plumped the pillows, preparing a nightly refuge that most of the world could only imagine. And yet, the gulf between straw and feather tells us more than simply who had comfort and who did not. It reveals how survival itself was stratified. For while peasants endured the hardness of straw and the endless need to refresh it, they still managed to carve out rest through habit and resilience, while the wealthy, cushioned in feathers, were nonetheless just as vulnerable to the greater enemy of frost creeping down their stone walls. In that sense, the feather bed was not an escape, but a reprieve, a temporary softness that could not erase the reality that outside the curtains, frost gathered, and the air itself seemed sharp enough to cut. So, whether one heard the crackle of straw beneath them, or felt the yielding embrace of feathers, the night remained a negotiation between comfort and cold, between human invention and the relentless breath of winter. These beds, humble or grand, remind us that in the end, everyone, from peasant to lord, faced the same battle, to steal warmth from a world that offered so little of it. Beneath all these beds, whether stuffed with straw or filled with feathers, the floors themselves told another story of survival, for medieval people tried to soften the hardness and cold of stone with rushes, long grasses, and plants cut from river banks and meadows that were spread across chambers as a crude form of insulation. At first glance, it must have seemed a clever solution, The rushes broke the chill that seeped up from the ground, muffled footsteps in cavernous halls, and for a short time lent a faintly sweet green scent to the air, a reminder of the fields from which they came. Servants laid them down in thick layers, sometimes woven with herbs such as lavender or chamomile, not only for fragrance, but in the hope of discouraging pests. For a little while the floors felt softer, the chambers less dark, and the dampness of stone less oppressive. Yet the reality was far less pleasant once weeks passed, for the rushes quickly grew filthy, trampled underfoot by boots and gowns, soaked with spilled ale and grease from feasts, and matted with the grime of daily life. In the great hall, where dozens or even hundreds might gather, the once fresh covering became a carpet of refuse, hiding scraps of food, hair, dirt, and worse within its tangled layers. The herbs lost their fragrance, replaced by the smell of decay and smoke, and what had begun as insulation turned into a breeding ground for insects and disease. Some households replaced the rushes only once or twice a year, allowing months of filth to accumulate until the floor beneath became almost indistinguishable from the refuse above. Imagine stepping out of a grand feather bed in the morning, your feet sinking not into polished boards or smooth stone, but into a crackling layer of broken stalks that gave way with a damp crunch, the scent no longer fresh but sour. For the poor in cottages, rushes served a similar purpose, so in smaller spaces they were more manageable, changed more often, and mixed with whatever local herbs were at hand. Even there, however, they were never truly clean, and families grew accustomed to living with the ever-present dust and dirt. What is most striking is how ordinary this practice became, how people accepted it as part of life, a trade-off between bare stone that froze the feet and a soft layer that kept in a little warmth but carried with it its own kind of discomfort. The rushes were never meant to be perfect. They were simply one more compromise in a world where the fight against cold and dampness had no easy victories. They remind us that medieval life was built not on luxuries, but on improvisations, where even the floor beneath your feet spoke of a struggle between survival and squalor, and where warmth was won only by tolerating the hidden cost it carried. But the story of bedding and flooring does not end with straw or feathers alone, for medieval people understood that survival required more than warmth. It required protection against the smaller, unseen senses that thrived in the shadows of damp stone chambers. To counter this, herbs were often mixed into the straw of mattresses or scattered among the rushes spread across floors, not merely as a pleasant decoration, but as a practical defense. Fragrant plants, such as lavender, chamomile, and mint, were chosen for their sweet scents, masking the stale odor of smoke and sweat that clung to enclosed rooms, while sharper herbs like rosemary, wormwood, and rue were valued for their ability to repel insects and vermin. The simple act of walking across a floor covered with such rushes released a faint aroma, turning each step into a kind of ritual cleansing, a small luxury in a world where bathing was rare and cleanliness was difficult to maintain. Picture a chamber freshly laid with new rushes, the green stalks mixed with sprigs of dried thyme and lavender, the air briefly transformed from the chill of stone to something reminiscent of summer fields. As the family settled in for the night, the fragrance lingered, softening the harshness of their environment, while at the same time working quietly to drive away fleas, lice, and the endless scuttling creatures that flourished in the cracks of wood and stone. For the wealthy, the use of herbs was yet another marker of status, their floors and bedding laced with costly imports like cinnamon or cloves, scents so rare that they turned an ordinary survival tactic into a performance of wealth. For the poor, however, the herbs were whatever could be gathered from the local hedgerows, humble plants pressed into service, not for display, but for necessity. Over time, of course, the rushes grew filthy, the herbs withered, and the fragrance was overwhelmed by the stronger smells of life smoke from the hearth, grease from feast, damp from stone walls, but for those first days they offered a sweetness that lifted spirits as well as discouraged pests. Travelers often remarked upon this practice, noting the curious mixture of beauty and practicality it represented. A reminder that medieval households, whether grand or humble, relied on nature itself to make their environments more livable. In the end, the mixing of herbs into straw and rushes was not a luxury, but a clever adaptation. One of countless small strategies by which people tried to bend their world into something survivable. It tells us that even in an age of drafty walls, icy chambers, and smoky hearths, people still sought out moments of comfort, weaving together warmth, fragrance, and a measure of protection into the very fabric of their daily lives. These herbs, scattered on floors and stuffed into mattresses, were tokens of resilience. Proof that survival in the medieval world was as much about small acts of ingenuity as it was about enduring hardship. And still, for all the layers of wool, the herbs woven into rushes, and the towering canopy beds that trapped what little warmth there was, the cold often proved too stubborn to ignore. Which is why one of the most cherished tools of the medieval household was the warming pan, a seemingly simple object that carried with it the power to turn a bed from a place of icy dread into a haven of tolerable comfort. These pans, fashioned of brass or copper with a long wooden handle, were filled with glowing coals drawn straight from the hearth and then slid carefully between the sheets, their hot metal lids rattling as they traced slow, deliberate paths across linen and wool, leaving behind pockets of blessed warmth. The ritual was more than practical. It was almost ceremonial, a final act of defiance against the cold before surrendering to sleep. Imagine the scene. A servant carries the pan upstairs, the faint hiss and crackle of coals within echoing softly in the stairwell, the handle clutched tight to keep the heat at bay. In the chamber above, curtains are drawn, garments are folded away, and then the warming pan is passed methodically over the mattress, the heat sinking into the feather or straw beneath, melting the bite of frost that had crept in while the bed stood untouched. For the noble about to climb in, the first touch of warmth against their skin would have felt like a luxury beyond measure, a fleeting reminder of the hearth left behind downstairs. Yet, for all its comfort, the pan carried dangers. 2-4 embers did not discriminate between heating cloth and burning it, and stories survive of beds catching fire in the middle of the night, a servant scolded, or worse, for leaving coals smoldering too long. Even without disaster, the pans often left scorch marks or singed edges on sheets, proof of how fine the line was between relief and risk. Still, such hazards were endured willingly, because without them, the shock of sliding into a bed that felt as though it had been left out of doors was unbearable. The wealthy enjoyed these pans most often, their households equipped with the tools and servants to tend them, while peasants relied more on sheer layering, body heat, and the occasional hot stone wrapped in cloth. But in every case, the desire was the same: to take the edge off the night's cold, to turn sleep from a test of endurance into something closer to rest. The warming pan, with its faint glow and its brief gift of comfort, symbolized the constant negotiation between survival and danger, ingenuity and necessity. In the end, the memory of those pans reminds us that warmth in a medieval castle was never guaranteed, but had to be coaxed, managed, and sometimes fought for. And that even in the grandest chambers, it took not only architecture and clothing, but tools of fire itself to make the long winter nights bearable. Yet this very tool that promised such comfort also carried with it a danger that no household could entirely forget. For the excessive use of warming pans sometimes turned the blessing of heat into a source of harm. Coals, after all, were not gentle, and though the lids of the pans kept them contained, the heat they radiated could be fierce enough to scorch linen, singe wool, or even ignite the straw beneath a mattress if the pan lingered too long in one place. Servants tasked with preparing beds walked a narrow line between providing enough warmth to make the chamber tolerable and causing damage that could prove catastrophic. A distracted moment, an inattentive pass across the sheets, and the fine linens of a noble household might suddenly smolder. A faint trail of smoke curling upward to signal that comfort had tipped into danger. Accounts survive of sheets marked with blackened circles, of blankets eaten through by careless use, and even of flames rising suddenly in the stillness of night, forcing entire households into chaos as servants rushed with buckets of water to extinguish the blaze. Burns were another risk, for those who carried the pans had to grip their long wooden handles firmly and keep their arms steady, knowing that one slip could bring the searing heat against skin. Some masters, it is said, bore scars from attempting to use the pans themselves, impatient to crawl into a warm bed and unwilling to wait for a servant's careful preparation. The irony is almost poetic. The very tool meant to soften the bite of cold carried the potential to cause pain that was far worse than a sleepless night. And yet, the practice endured. For the alternative was unthinkable slipping between sheets that felt like ice, lying awake as the chill gnawed at every limb. Nobles considered the risk worth taking, and servants accepted the burden, knowing that their work was as essential as tending the hearth fire itself. For peasants, who could rarely afford such pans, the danger was less present, though they sometimes imitated the method with heated stones wrapped in cloth. Even these makeshift versions carried risks of burns and scorched bedding. But like their wealthier counterparts, they chose to gamble with danger rather than surrender entirely to the cold. In the end, the warming pan stands as a vivid reminder of how precarious medieval comfort truly was. Safety was always balanced against necessity, and luxury itself could conceal hidden perils. What mattered was not eliminating danger, but managing it, accepting that in a world where frost crept across walls and ice formed in basins indoors, every attempt at warmth demanded both ingenuity and caution, and even the glow of coals could never be entirely trusted. Clothing, too, played a central role in the nightly battle against the cold, for while layers of wool and furs by day offered protection from the winter air, night demanded its own form of armor, and so people turned to night clothes not merely for modesty, but for insulation. That could mean the difference between a restless shiver and a few hours of true rest. Unlike the silken gowns or elaborate garments we might imagine in tales of nobility, the reality was far more practical. Long linen shirts, often reaching to the ankles, provided a breathable yet insulating base, while woolen stockings, caps, and sometimes even gloves completed the attire, ensuring that no part of the body was left exposed to the icy breath of the chamber. To dress for bed was not a gesture of relaxation, but a continuation of the day's vigilance against the cold. Imagine slipping into such garments after a long evening in a drafty hall. The linen cool at first against the skin, but quickly warming beneath additional layers, a simple comfort in an otherwise unforgiving environment. The cap, though plain, served a vital purpose. For much heat escapes through the head, and to cover it was to preserve a little more warmth against the stone walls that seemed always to radiate chill. Even hands and feet, so easily numbed, were wrapped in cloth or wool before the curtains of the bed were drawn, each article of clothing adding to the fragile cocoon that stood between the sleeper and the merciless air. For the wealthy, these nightclothes might be finely woven, their linen smoother, their wool dyed in richer colors, but the principle was no different from that of the peasant who pulled on whatever scraps of fabric could be spared. Both sought the same goal, to carry warmth upon the body when the world outside, and even within, refused to give it freely. Modesty, too, played its part, for to wear a long shirt or shift was not only practical, but socially expected, an expression of propriety, even in the private act of sleep. To climb into bed, unclothed, in a chamber where servants might come and go, or where family members shared the same room, was considered unseemly. So nightclothes carried with them a dual purpose, guarding dignity as well as guarding against frost. There is something deeply human in this picture. The drawing close of curtains, the careful layering of fabric, the tugging of a cap into place before surrendering to slumber. It speaks of a world where even rest was an act of preparation, where every thread and seam became part of the fight to make night survivable. And it reminds us that warmth, in an age before central heating or insulated walls, was never taken for granted, but stitched together each evening with patience, modesty, and a quiet resilience of cloth against cold. Even with layers of linen, shirts, woolen hose, and fur-lined cloaks, the most vulnerable parts of the body, fingers, toes, and ears, remained at constant risk. And so, people turned to the simplest yet most effective measure they knew, wrapping their extremities in strips of cloth to keep the cold at bay. It was a practice born, not from elegance, but from necessity, an act repeated night after night as families prepared for rest. Winding rags tightly around hands and feet before slipping under blankets. The body might have been swaddled in layers of clothing already, but the extremities, so easily numbed, demanded special attention. For without protection, they could stiffen painfully in the darkness, the chill biting until sleep was impossible. Imagine a servant in a drafty chamber, sitting by the last glow of the fire and methodically binding strips of wool about their toes, pulling them snug and tucking the edges so that they would not unravel during the night. Beside them, another wound cloth around their fingers, leaving just enough dexterity to draw curtains closed or adjust a coverlet. This nightly ritual was not limited to the poor. Nobles, too, relied on the same method, though their wrappings might be softer, fashioned from finer fabric, and often perfumed or embroidered to show wealth. Yet the principle remained identical: to preserve warmth where it was most fleeting, to guard the body's edges against the creeping frost that stone walls invited in. It was a strangely intimate defense, a reminder that survival was often secured by the smallest gestures. These makeshift wrappings transformed scraps of cloth into shields, preventing the chill from gnawing into the body's furthest reaches. Without them, night could bring more than discomfort. Day could bring lasting damage. For in the bitterest winters, the cold did not merely disturb sleep, but threatened the flesh itself, leaving extremities stiff, pale, and aching. Medieval people may not have used the modern word for frostbite, but they knew its warning signs well enough and treated them with the seriousness they deserved. Children were often wrapped most carefully, their parents tucking cloth about their tiny feet and hands before laying them between layers of blankets, while travelers spoke of nights spent in unfamiliar chambers where such bindings made the difference between waking sore and waking intact. Some even layered gloves over their wrappings or pulled caps down so low that only the nose remained uncovered, cocooning every vulnerable point. Thus, the image of medieval sleep becomes more vivid. Beds raised high, curtains drawn, warming pans passed across the sheets. And finally, the quiet act of winding cloth about fingers and toes before surrendering to rest. It was one more strategy in the endless struggle against the cold, and though it may seem humble compared to feather beds or ornate canopies, it was perhaps among the most vital, for in those careful wrappings lay the assurance that the body would greet the morning whole, despite the winter night pressing in all around. Even with all these measures, the layering of clothes, the wrapping of extremities, the raised beds, and heavy curtains, there were still nights when the cold proved too great for any single person to endure alone, and so one of the oldest and most practical solutions was simply to share the bed itself, turning sleep into a communal act of survival. Families often gathered beneath the same blankets. Children nestled against parents, grandparents close at hand, a press of bodies, creating a shared reservoir of warmth that no hearth or fur could match. It was not seen as unusual, but entirely expected for, in a world where frost crept along chamber. Walls and air whistled through every shutter. The warmth of another human being was both the most reliable and the most immediate comfort. Imagine climbing into bed on a bitter January night. The sheets already chilled despite the warming pan, your toes numb even after layers of cloth, and then feeling the weight and presence of another body beside you, the heat of their breath, the steady rhythm of their heartbeat. The simple reassurance of not facing the long hours of darkness alone. This intimacy was not reserved only for families. Servants often slept near or even beside their masters, sharing the same bed when conditions demanded, and travelers, too, were accustomed to the practice, finding themselves lying side by side with strangers at inns or in borrowed chambers, comfort outweighing any sense of awkwardness. To us, it might feel like an invasion of privacy, but to them, it was common sense, a custom as ordinary as lighting a fire or pulling curtains closed. The wealthy, of course, could afford larger beds with space enough for several bodies, while the poor may do with narrower pallets. Yet in both cases, the principle was the same. Survival meant togetherness. In cottages, families lay shoulder to shoulder across straw mattresses, their combined body heat creating a cocoon within the smoky, cramped rooms. In castles, where chambers were vast and stone radiated cold from every wall, even the most richly dressed nobles sometimes shared their bed, not just with family, but with trusted attendants, the warmth of multiple bodies outweighing the value of solitude. It was not merely practical, but deeply human, for in those nights of shared sleep bonds were strengthened, fears were eased, and the long hours of winter seemed less cruel. The night became a collective experience rather than an individual trial, and in that closeness lay a resilience that no stone wall or heavy fur could provide on its own. Thus, bed sharing reminds us of a truth often forgotten when we imagine the grandeur of medieval life, that survival depended not just on wealth or status, but on the willingness to huddle together against the cold, to place comfort above formality, and to accept that warmth. The most basic of human needs was often found not in objects or architecture, but in the presence of another person. And when even the shared warmth of human bodies was not enough to keep away the relentless bite of winter, people sometimes turned to companions of another kind, allowing dogs, and in more modest homes, even livestock, to join them in their sleeping quarters, transforming animals into living sources of heat. In noble chambers, faithful hounds were not merely guards or hunters by day, but valued bedfellows by night, their bodies radiating warmth that seeped through layers of blankets and furs. To feel the steady weight of a dog curled at one's feet was both a comfort and a shield against the frost that crept in at every corner. A reminder that survival often came from companionship as much as from wealth. Imagine a grand bed in a drafty castle, its canopy curtains drawn tight, its mattress laden with feather-filled softness, and at the foot of it, a large mastiff or greyhound nestled close, its breathing slow and rhythmic, the warmth of its body spreading across frozen sheets. The noble within might draw their fur coverlet higher, knowing that the animal was not only a trusted guardian, but also an indispensable ally against the cold. Travelers, too, wrote of inns where strangers shared rooms not only with one another, but with dogs and, sometimes, with goats or sheep brought inside for the night. The closeness of many bodies forging a pocket of warmth where the outside world could not intrude. For peasants, the practice was even more practical. For their cottages, small and smoky, often doubled as shelter for animals during the harshest months. A cow or goat penned at one end of the house gave off a steady heat that filled the cramped space, and chickens roosting nearby added to the sense of shared survival. Children fell asleep to the sound of lowing or clucking, their blankets warmed not only by their family, but by the presence of creatures that made up the household's livelihood. To us, the idea of livestock indoors may seem strange, but to them it was a necessity, a decision that blurred the line between human and animal space in the name of survival. This mingling of lives created bonds of its own. Dogs became not only guardians, but companions in the truest sense, woven into the nightly ritual of sleep, while livestock, though less sentimental, became silent partners in the fight against winter's cruelty. It is easy to imagine a weary farmer resting his head at night, comforted not just by the nearness of his family, but by the muffled breathing of the animals whose heat ensured that all within the cottage could rise again to face another day. Thus, the story of medieval nights is not only one of stone walls, heavy blankets, and canopy beds, but also of the warmth of creatures who shared those long hours. In the end, survival was not a solitary act, but a collective one, where humans and animals alike came together beneath one roof, proving that in the coldest of worlds, companionship, whether two-legged or fours, the most reliable fire of all. Yet even with shared beds, loyal dogs at their feet, can every trick of cloth and curtain, code, could still dictate how people lived within the vast stone labyrinths they called home. And so families often practiced a kind of seasonal migration inside their own castles, moving their sleeping quarters from one chamber to another, depending on the time of year. It was an unspoken rhythm of life, a recognition that no room was ever equally habitable throughout the seasons. For what felt like a blessed refuge in summer could become an unbearable icebox in winter, and what offered sunlight in the warmer months might turn suffocating when the heat of midsummer pressed against the walls. Imagine the household in autumn, servants bustling to move bedding, hang new curtains, and rearrange furniture as the family abandoned a lofty chamber high in a tower so airy and pleasant in July, but now exposed to every cruel gust of wind whistling through arrow-slit sand, descended instead into rooms tucked deeper within the castle, where the stones seemed to shelter them more fully from winter's bite. Beds were dragged across flagstones, straw replaced, feather mattresses hefted down staircases, and tapestries rehung, all to chase those elusive patches of warmth and stillness that could mean survival in the months ahead. In summer, the process reversed. Families left behind the enclosed, dimly lit rooms where they had huddled against the cold, and returned to sunnier, breezier chambers, the curtains thrown open to let in light and air. It was a migration without distance, but filled with significance, a reshaping of daily life that echoed the seasons themselves. To choose the wrong chamber was to risk misery, for the castle was never uniform. Some walls held the sun longer, some corners funneled wind more fiercely, and the knowledge of these subtle differences passed from one generation to the next, shaping where a household would sleep each season. For the wealthy, this migration was almost ceremonial, marked by processions of servants carrying bed linens, cushions, and trunks of clothing, each move reflecting both necessity and status. For the poor, who lived in smaller, simpler rooms within the outer buildings of a castle or in cottages nearby, the seasonal movement was less elaborate, but no less important, perhaps shifting closer to the hearth in winter, and back toward doorways or windows in summer, always searching for the balance that might make life just a little more bearable. What this seasonal shifting reveals is how profoundly medieval people adapted their lives to their environment. They did not imagine their castles as fixed spaces, but as landscapes to be navigated, where survival required constant negotiation with the cold, the heat, and the whims of weather. It is a reminder that even in the grandest fortresses, life was not static, but fluid, responsive, and shaped by nature's rhythms. With every bed moved a small but vital gesture in the endless search for comfort. Of course, one of the greatest weaknesses of medieval castles, and indeed of most buildings of the age, was found in their windows. For the transparent glass we take for granted today was a luxury so rare and costly that few ever saw it outside cathedrals or the wealthiest estates. And so most households relied instead on shutters of wood, sheets of oiled cloth, or thin slices of polished horn to cover the openings in their walls. These substitutes were practical in their own ways, but never perfect. And every night they reminded inhabitants that their fortress, no matter how thick its walls, could never truly seal itself against the outside world. Imagine a chamber high in a castle tower as evening falls. The shutters are swung closed with a groan, their heavy planks creaking as the iron latch is set in place, yet the gaps between boards still admit the hiss of the wind. In poorer rooms, where shutters might not exist at all, oiled cloth was stretched across the openings, translucent enough to let in a pale glow by day, but fluttering in the slightest breeze, offering little more than a flimsy veil against the elements. For those who could afford horn panels, painstakingly shaved thin until they allowed a dim light to pass through, the effect was finer, but still imperfect, for the material yellowed and cracked with age, warping in the damp and leaving fissures that became new pathways for drafts. The difference between day and night was especially stark. By sunlight, such coverings provided a semblance of protection, muting the glare of the outside world. But once the temperature dropped, their failings were laid bare. The air crept in relentlessly, sliding past shutters, lifting the edges of cloth, finding its way through seams and horn panels, until no matter how many tapestries were hung or curtains drawn, the cold made itself at home. Families grew accustomed to hearing the wind whistle faintly through their chambers, the shutters rattling like restless spirits in the dark, and it became part of the nightly soundscape of castle life. For peasants in cottages, the story was no different. Small windows were often little more than holes cut into walls, plugged with shutters by night and opened by day. The constant balance between the need for light and the desperate desire to keep out the cold. In summer, such openings brought relief, letting breezes stir the smoky air, but in winter, they were an enemy that could never be fully defeated. What these window coverings reveal is a world always negotiating with imperfection, where every solution carried a compromise. Shutters were sturdy but dark, cloth allowed light but admitted drafts, corn provided translucence but decayed quickly, and glass, when it appeared, was so rare that it was considered a marvel. For those who lived within castles, the window was both a connection to the outside world and a betrayal of their defenses, a reminder each night that even the strongest stone could not keep nature entirely at bay. And no matter how carefully shutters were closed, how tightly oiled cloth was stretched, or how finely horn panels were fitted into their frames, the drafts remained, constant intruders sliding in through every seam and crack, until the chambers of even the greatest castles felt perpetually cold. It was not a sudden gust, but a ceaseless, invisible presence, a breath of the outside world that never stopped, whispering along the floors, tugging at the edges of tapestries, and extinguishing candles left too close to the wall. A cable learned to live with it as they might endure a chronic axe, something unwelcome, persistent, and impossible to ignore, because no amount of wealth or ingenuity seemed able to chase it away entirely. Picture yourself standing in a noble's chamber on a winter evening. The shutters have been barred, a heavy curtain drawn across them, and as you approach the wall, you feel it, that faint but undeniable current of cold that brushes against your cheek and curls around your ankles. The fire crackles in the hearth, but the warmth it gives is always local, and beyond its glow, the air moves with a restless chill. The bed curtains sway ever so slightly, betraying the hidden paths the drafts take through the room. To lie beneath the covers is to feel them creep across your face, not sharp enough to wake you outright, but persistent enough to keep sleep shallow. A reminder through every hour of darkness that the castle itself could never truly seal you off from the elements. Travelers often commented on this, noting how in castles and manor houses alike, there was always the sense of being outdoors, even while indoors, as if the boundary between the world within and the world without was paper thin. Drafts were not just nuisances. They carried dampness, leaving garments clammy and hearth smoke reluctant to rise, filling the air with a heaviness that clung to lungs and fabrics alike. Children grew up accustomed to the sound of shutters rattling against their frames, and servants knew the endless task of hanging, patching, adjusting curtains in a vain attempt to tame the air that slipped in regardless. In cottages, the same was true, though on a smaller scale. Capes and walls stuffed with mud and straw let the wind sigh through in winter, and while the fire in the hearth might hold it back for a time, once the flames died down, the cold reasserted itself with quiet authority. Yet, while peasants grumbled, nobles complained, and travelers cursed, the drafts never ceased. Their persistence, a kind of cruel reminder that in the medieval world, halls, shutters, and coverings could blunt the force of nature, but never defeat it. Thus, the chambers of castles, no matter how splendidly adorned, remained perpetually cold, their beauty always shadowed by the restless breath of the outside world pressing in, turning even the most private space into a place of compromise, where comfort was never given but always stolen, moment by moment. If drafts were the ever-present enemy, then fire was a constant weapon used to fight it. Yet this weapon came at a staggering cost, for the flames that offered a few fleeting hours of warmth consumed timber in such enormous quantities that they strained the sources of households, villages, and sometimes even entire regions. A single castle, with its vast halls, multiple hearths, and constant need for light and heat, devoured wood at a pace that was almost impossible to sustain. Servants labored endlessly to haul logs, their days spent dragging cartloads from surrounding forests, splitting them into pieces, stacking them by the walls of the great hall, and feeding them to fires that seemed always hungry and never satisfied. Imagine the rhythm of a winter's week in such a place. At dawn, the embers from the night before are little more than faint glows, and servants hurry to coax them back into flame, piling on logs until the chamber fills with the crackle of burning wood. By midday, the fire roars, consuming timber so quickly that piles carefully prepared in the autumn already begin to dwindle, the household always aware that another cartload must soon be fetched. And by evening, though the flames may leap high enough to cast shadows across the vaulted ceiling, the warmth still struggles to reach those sitting more than a few paces away, making the cost feel all the more cruel. Forests near large castles often bore the scars of this endless hunger, their edges stripped back season after season, their trees felled not for building or craft, but simply to be burned to ash. Chroniclers wrote of estates where fuel grew scarce, forcing lords to send wagons further afield, pressing peasants into the exhausting labor of cutting, hauling, and delivering wood through snow-bound paths. For poorer families, the strain was even harsher, for when nobles claimed rights to nearby forest, villagers had little choice but to make do with scraps, twigs, brushwood, or even dried dung pressed into cakes, all burned in small hearts that smoked heavily but at least gave off some heat. The irony was stark. The wealthiest households with their largest fires were also those that placed the greatest strain on their surroundings, while the poorest, with their meager means, stretched every scrap of fuel as far as it would go. Fire was a comfort, yes, but it was also a reminder of dependence, a fragile balance between survival and exhaustion of the land. And so the blazing hearth, so often imagined as the heart of medieval life, carried with it a hidden shadow, the knowledge that each spark cost dearly, that every moment of warmth devoured a tree that had taken decades to grow. To sit before a roaring fire in a castle hall was to enjoy not only heat, but also the silent weight of all the labor and sacrifice required to sustain it. Proof that even comfort in that world was never free, but purchased with the toil of many hands and the bones of the forests beyond the walls. And if the hunger of fire placed a burden on forests and servants alike, its smoke placed a burden on the very people it was meant to protect. For the open hearths and primitive chimneys of the medieval world rarely carried their fumes cleanly away. And so the same flames that offered light and warmth also filled rooms with a haze that choked lungs, stung eyes, and left its mark upon every fabric, beam, and tapestry it touched. In the vastness of a great hall, the air might clear, eventually the smoke rising into rafters high above where it lingered in shadowy clouds, but in smaller chambers, it clung stubbornly, curling into every corner until the smell of ash became as much a part of life as the smell of wool or damp stone. Imagine sitting in such a hall during a feast. The fire roars, logs crack and pop, But as the hours pass, a haze thickens until faces across the table appear blurred, and those nearest the hearth cough as sparks and soot ride upward with the flames. Servants move through the dim light with watering eyes and fine fabrics gowns, tunics, wall hangings, drink in the scent until no amount of washing can entirely erase it. By morning, the residue has settled across the rushes on the floor, coating them with a dull film, and along the walls, tapestries darken, their vibrant colors muted beneath a skin of soot. The effect on health was even more insidious. Inhaling smoke night after night left throats raw and lungs heavy. And though no one at the time had the words to describe chronic respiratory illness, the consequences were plain. Persistent coughing, shortness of breath, and the slow wearing away of strength. Children grew up with it, elders endured it, and travelers remarked upon it, yet it was accepted as unavoidable, the price one paid for fire. The irony was cruel. The very element that protected against frost was itself an invisible enemy, creeping not through cracks or drafts, but directly into the body. Nor did the wealthy escape it. Their grand chimneys may have been wider, their fires greater, but the design was still crude, and downdrafts often forced smoke back into chambers, filling rooms with acrid haze, despite all attempts at improvement. Even the most splendid canopy bed could not entirely shut it out. Its curtains kept away drafts, but they also trapped the lingering smell of soot. In peasants' cottages, the situation was harsher still. The central hearth, often without a chimney at all, smoke simply venting through a hole in the roof, leaving rafters black and air so thick that one had to crouch low just to breathe more easily. Thus, fire was always a double-edged gift. It gave life, yet it also marked its price upon the very bodies it sustained, etching itself into lungs and lungs, fabrics and walls. To live in a world of stone castles and thatched cottages was to live in a haze that never fully cleared. It's a world where warmth came bound to smoke, and every flicker of flame carried both comfort and quiet harm. And yet, in one of history's quiet ironies, the smoky hearts of peasants often proved more efficient at warming their homes than the grand fires of noble halls, for while the latter blazed with drama-consuming mountains of timber, only to leave most of the chambers still shivering, the former small and smoky, though it was concentrated, its heat within the snug confines of a cottage. A peasant ass hearth was usually little more than a pit or a raised stone platform at the center of a single-room dwelling. The fire fed with brushwood, twigs, or dried dung when timber was scarce. Its flames curled upward toward a hole in the thatched roof, releasing smoke in erratic streams that left rafters blackened and air heavy. Yet despite the discomfort it produced, the warmth had nowhere to escape but into the bodies huddled close around it. Picture a cold January evening in such a cottage. Outside, the wind lashes against the walls and snow presses against the doorframe. But within a single chamber, the family gathers around the hearth, their faces lit by the flicker of orange glow. The smoke stings their eyes, yes, and coats their throats. But the heat radiates outward, soaking into the straw pallets at the edges of the room, into the clothes hanging from pegs, into every object within the confined space. Chickens roost on the rafters, a goat shuffles near the wall, and all of them contribute their own warmth, creating an atmosphere that, while smoky and pungent, is undeniably warmer and more consistent than the vast and drafty expanses of a stone castle. The difference lay not in wealth, but in scale. In a castle, the fire might burn brightly, but its heat was swallowed whole by the immensity of stone walls and high ceilings, dissipating before it could spread. In a cottage, every ember counted, every flicker of flame captured by the low roof and close walls, the family's very presence bodies pressed together. Breath mingling with the haze helped trap the warmth, turning survival into a communal effort. Visitors to such dwellings sometimes remarked with a mixture of pity and envy. Pity for the smoky conditions, but envy for the snugness that even great lords with their roaring fires could not always replicate. It is a reminder that efficiency does not always come dressed in grandeur. The peasant's hearth, humble and smoky though it was, achieved what no sprawling great hall could: its creation of a space where fire truly reached every corner, where the struggle against winter was fought on a scale small enough to be one. In that sense, the poorest homes sometimes offered a truer comfort than the wealthiest, showing us that in the medieval world, warmth was not measured in the size of a fire or the amount of wood consumed, but in how wisely its heat was kept and shared. But warmth in the medieval world was never only a matter of firecloth or architecture. It was also deeply psychological, woven into the rituals people practiced each night to soften the chill and prepare themselves for the long hours ahead. One of the most enduring customs was the gathering in the great hall before bed, a ritual that served not just to warm the body by the fire, but to warm the mind with company, conversation, and the reassurance of shared endurance. Families, servants, and guests alike would cluster close to the flames, telling stories, playing music, or simply sitting in the glow, letting the fire's light become a kind of shield against the vast darkness outside and the cold waiting in their chambers. Imagine the atmosphere at such a gathering. The day's work is done, the feast has been cleared, and the hall is quieter now, the roar of earlier laughter reduced to the murmur of softer voices. A minstrel plucks a gentle tune, children doze in their mother's arms, and older men lean on their elbows, nursing cups of ale. The fire crackles, logs collapsing into embers, sending up sparks that vanish into the smoky haze above. Around this circle of light and warmth, people take comfort in the nearness of others, knowing that once they leave, the castle's cold corridors and icy chambers will close in around them. For a moment, they are not alone in their discomfort, but united, part of a community that faces the night together. This gathering acted almost as a form of mental insulation. To sit in a great hall and fill the senses with light, sound, and companionship was to push back the dread of slipping into frozen sheets. Children carried that memory of warmth with them to bed, and even adults, though chilled again within minutes of leaving the hearth, endured the cold more easily, having spent those final hours of the evening fortified by human presence. For many, it was not the body, but the spirit that needed tending, and the great hall became a place where courage was kindled alongside the flames. Peasants practiced similar rituals in their cottages, crowding near the hearth to share stories, sing songs, or simply listen to the crackle of firewood. In such modest homes, the closeness of family created not only heat but comfort, transforming smoky air and cramped quarters into something almost sacred. These nightly traditions made the difference between despair and endurance. For though the cold was always there, its weight was easier to bear when shared. Thus, the act of gathering before bed reminds us that survival was not only a physical struggle, but a psychological one. The great hall fire was a beacon not just of heat, but of solidarity. A nightly reminder that human warmth, laughter, story, companionship was every bit as vital as the logs consumed in the hearth. In the medieval night, to endure the cold was to endure it together. What becomes clear when we piece together all these habits and adaptations is that sleep in the medieval world was not a simple act of lying down and closing one's eyes, but a carefully engineered ritual built from layers of textiles, patterns of behavior, and strategies of survival that demanded thought and effort every single night. Modern people may take for granted the comfort of stepping into a bed already softened, warmed, and insulated by the technology of their homes, but in a drafty castle or a smoky cottage, rest itself had to be constructed from scratch. Each element woven together like the strands of a tapestry designed to hold off the cold. Picture the sequence. The day ends with gathering by the hearth, a psychological shield against the dark. Then servants or family members prepare the bed, drawing curtains, placing warming pans, and arranging layers of linen, wool, and fur. Night clothes are donned, extremities wrapped, herbs scattered among the rushes for scent and pest control, every gesture serving a purpose. The bed becomes a fortress within a fortress raised high, to avoid the cold floor enclosed with heavy drapes, to create a pocket of warm air lined with straw or feathers, depending on wealth, and shared with companions, both human and animal, to multiply the heat. Even the smallest details mattered. How tightly curtains were fastened, how many layers of cloth were worn, how well cracks were stuffed to keep out drafts. Sleep was never passive, was earned through labor, preparation, and ritual. And yet, there was a beauty in this labor, for it reveals how resilient and resourceful people were in the face of discomfort. To us, the thought of wrapping our fingers in cloth before bed, or moving chambers with the seasons, or lying down beside animals might feel strange. But to them, these were ordinary acts of wisdom, passed down through generations. They did not expect ease, they expected hardship, and so they built routines that turned hardship into habit. The cold was never banished, but it was managed, and in that management laid the foundation for rest. For nobles, these preparations became layered with ceremony. Their beds, symbols of wealth and power, their curtains, embroidered with stories and patterns, their furs, drawn from the farthest corners of trade. For peasants, the rituals were humbler but no less vital, rooted in closeness and simplicity, gathering tightly as a family, relying on the steady heat of the hearth, and making the most of every scrap of cloth they possessed. Both approaches revealed the same truth, that sleep was a nightly struggle to construct a space where the body could renew itself against the cold world outside. Thus, when we think of medieval nights, we should not imagine sleep as something easily won, but as a battle quietly fought each evening with fabric, fire, ritual, and resilience. Every night was a test, and every morning a small victory. Proof that even in a world of ice-laden walls and endless drafts, people found a way to rest, not because it was granted to them, but because they crafted it with care. In the end, whether one lived behind towering stone walls or within the low thatched roof of a cottage, survival through the long medieval winter was a constant negotiation between discomfort and adaptation. A balance struck day after day by both nobles and peasants alike. The trappings of wealth could soften certain hardships, offering feather beds instead of straw fur-lined cloaks, instead of rough wool and roaring hearths, instead of smoking pits. But the truth remained that cold was an enemy neither gold nor title could completely defeat. The drafts still crept through castle shutters, just as they slipped through cottage walls. The smoke still burned noble lungs as surely as it did peasant ones, and the frost still reached into both chambers, and hovels, reminding all that nature was the great equalizer. Imagine the lord of a manor, seated in his great hall, wrapped in a fur mantle, his goblet heavy with wine, yet still shifting uncomfortably as the chill seeps through the stone beneath his feet. Beyond those walls, a peasant farmer huddles with his family around a smoky hearth, their meager supper simmering in a pot, their breath rising in visible puffs as they share warmth, shoulder to shoulder. The distance between them in wealth and power is vast, yet in that moment, both are bound by the same reality. Survival is not easy, and comfort is always precarious. What distinguished one from the other was not freedom from hardship, but the strategies used to endure it. Nobles invested in heavy tapestries, intricate beds, and seasonal migrations within their castles, adapting through wealth and labor. Peasants leaned on closeness, simplicity, and resourcefulness, finding warmth in shared bodies, in the presence of animals, and in the efficiency of their smaller homes. Yet at their core, these strategies reflected the same human instinct to adapt, to adjust, to create spaces of endurance against forces beyond their control. This shared struggle fostered a strange kind of unity, though it was rarely acknowledged outright. Winters stripped away illusions of invulnerability, exposing the limits of stone walls and fine garments, just as they exposed the fragility of mud-packed cottages. The differences between noble and peasant mattered greatly in food, status, and opportunity. But when it came to the night's cold, both were humbled before the same relentless season. To survive was to accept discomfort as an unavoidable companion and adaptation as the only path forward. Each layer of cloth, each log of firewood, each ritual of gathering or prayer was not merely a habit, but a declaration that life would continue even against the odds. And so, the medieval winter became not just a test of endurance, but a shared experience across every rank of society, weaving together the lives of nobles and peasants in ways they themselves might never have spoken of, but could certainly feel. Thus, the story of those long winters is not one of division, but of convergence. A reminder that beneath the surface of hierarchy and privilege lay a deeper truth. Survival belonged to those who could endure, who could adapt, and who could turn hardship into habit until spring finally returned. The very way people slept in the medieval world told a story of who they were, what they possessed, and how they managed the relentless demands of their environment. For sleeping arrangements were never just about comfort, but a mirror of social class, wealth, and sheer practicality. A noble's chamber spoke of power, layered in luxury and adorned with symbols meant to impress, while a peasant's cottage reflected necessity. Its arrangements, simple yet effective, born of experience and survival. Between these two extremes stretched a spectrum of lives, each bed and blanket a quiet testimony to status and circumstance. Step into the room of a great lord or lady, and the bed immediately commands attention. It is not merely a place to sleep, but the centerpiece of the chamber, raised high on carved legs, crowned with a canopy, and surrounded by curtains of heavy fabric, embroidered with intricate designs. To climb into such a bed is itself a ritual, a reminder of rank with servants, helping to prepare the linens, warm the covers, and secure the drapes that transform the space into a private cocoon of warmth and protection. Feather mattresses, fur coverlets, and fine sheets ensured that rest was layered with the wealth of trade networks and the labor of countless hands. Even so, the grandeur could not always defeat the cold, but it declared, nonetheless, that this was a household of means. Now, step into a peasant's cottage, and the contrast is immediate. Beds might be simple wooden frames filled with straw, sometimes nothing more than a pile of rushes and cloth shared by an entire family. Privacy was a rare luxury, and the closeness of kin servants, or even animals, was less a choice than a necessity, the shared body heat forming the only true insulation against a night's chill. A single blanket might serve several sleepers, and clothing worn by day often doubled as nightwear. What lacked in refinement was made up for in practicality, each element chosen not for display but for function, and every scrap of fabric pressed into service against the cold. Between these poles lay other variations. Monastic communities, for instance, practiced strict simplicity, their beds narrow and plain, reflecting vows of poverty and discipline, yet arranged in dormitories that echoed the same need for warmth through shared presence. Inns and way stations offered straw mattresses for travelers, sometimes shared between strangers, a practice less about comfort than efficiency, ensuring everybody had a place to rest. In all these settings, sleep was both universal and deeply divided. A noble's canopy bed might represent lineage, prestige, and authority, while a peasant's pallet embodied endurance, thrift, and adaptation. Yet both arrangements served the same ultimate purpose, to carve out a space where the body could renew itself against a cold and demanding world. Thus, the sleeping arrangements of medieval society stand as more than furniture or habit. They are living symbols of how wealth and necessity shaped the night. Each bed, whether draped in velvet or stuffed with straw, prespoke a story of status, survival, and the endless search for warmth in a world that gave nothing freely. Taken together, all these details remind us that sleep in the medieval world was never effortless, never a simple luxury to be enjoyed at will, but rather a nightly battle waged against the forces of cold drafts and dampness that crept relentlessly into every chamber and cottage. Each evening was a campaign of preparation, a careful layering of textiles, rituals, and strategies as men and women sought to carve out a fragile pocket of warmth and rest in an environment that resisted them at every turn. To modernize, the thought of climbing into bed beneath heavy curtains, wrapped in furs, with a dog at your feet, and perhaps a companion beside you, might seem quaint or even romantic, but to those who lived it, the act was less about comfort and more about survival. The cold was not an intruder that could be banished once and for all. It was a presence woven into the very fabric of medieval life, seeping through walls, slipping through shutters, coiling into rooms through unseen cracks until it lingered even on one's breath. Every night, people rose to the challenge in small but meaningful ways, lighting fires that demanded endless supplies of timber-hanging tapestries to blunt the chill, scattering herbs among rushes for freshness and pest control, or arranging beds so that curtains and coverlets might trap just enough warmth to make the hours bearable. These measures did not conquer the cold, but they managed it, buying precious hours of rest so that the struggle could begin anew the next day. Imagine a noble household at night, servants tending the final embers in the great hall, nobles retreating to their chambers where curtains are drawn tight and warming pans carried carefully from hearth to bed. In another corner of the world, a peasant family does the same in humbler fashion, huddling together near a smoky hearth, children curled against parents, animals shifting in the shadows, all sharing their breath and warmth to outlast the frost. The contrast in wealth is immense. Yet the challenge each faces is strikingly similar: the need to outwit the elements long enough to find rest. It was, in truth, a contest without final victory. Fires guttered, drafts persisted, damp settled in, and frost often crept across the insides of walls and windows, reminding everyone that nature had the final word. Yet within that struggle lay resilience, ingenuity, and an enduring human spirit. People learned not to expect ease, but to build routines that transformed difficulty into habit, rituals that gave the night shape and meaning, even as the cold pressed in. Thus, when we picture medieval sleep, we should see not a world of quiet, effortless slumber, but of ongoing resistance, a nightly confrontation between human ingenuity and the forces of nature. To sleep was to endure, and to endure was to triumph in small, hard-won ways. Each morning was proof that the battle, though never truly won, had been survived once again. And in that survival lay the quiet strength of an age defined not by comfort, but by perseverance. When we step back and take in the full picture of medieval life, one truth becomes unshakably clear. The night was not a time of ease and comfort, but of constant battle against forces that pressed in on every side. Castles, despite their imposing size and strength, were no sanctuaries from the cold. Their thick stone walls trapped chill rather than kept it out, and their vast interiors echoed with drafts that no shutter, cloth, or horn panel could fully repel. Fires, though tended with great effort, gave only limited relief, consuming timber at unsustainable rates while leaving chambers still perpetually cold and often smoke-filled. What warmth they did provide vanished quickly once the flames died down, plunging even the grandest of halls back into an icy silence. Peasants, in their humbler cottages, faced the same hardships, but on a scale more intimate and in many ways more efficient. Their smoky hearts, though simple and suffocating at times, concentrated heat within their small homes far better than any noble hall, allowing families to endure through closeness, shared labor, and the presence of animals. Nobles had their canopy beds with embroidered curtains, feather mattresses, and servants carrying warming pans filled with glowing coals. Yet still they shivered in chambers where frost crept across the walls. Peasants, with straw bedding and coarse linen, relied on resourcefulness and togetherness. Their survival, carried by necessity, rather than wealth. And yet, whether rich or poor, no one could take sleep for granted. The night demanded preparation. People dressed in layers of wool, linen, and furs wrapped their extremities against frostbite and pulled long linen shirts and caps close about them. Beds were engineered like fortresses within fortresses raised from the floor, enclosed with heavy curtains and lined with whatever materials could provide insulation. Families and servants alike shared beds not only for space but for warmth. While travelers learned the same lesson in roadside inns. Dogs curled at the feet of nobles, and livestock lay near peasant hearths, their warmth indispensable. The very act of sleeping became an art of survival, crafted from textiles, rituals, and psychology. Families gathered in the glow of a fire before bed, not only to soak in its fleeting heat, but to fill their hearts with companionship and stories, fortifying themselves against the solitude of cold chambers. Seasonal migration within castles showed how carefully people read their environment. Moving beds from drafty towers to sunnier rooms, from summer air to winter refuge. Even the herbs scattered among rushes or the choice of fabrics told of a constant human effort to push back against discomfort. What emerges is not a tale of luxury or ease, but one of resilience. Nobles and peasants alike were bound by the same nightly challenge, their strategies shaped by class and circumstance, but their goal identical: to carve out a small island of warmth against a relentless cold. Social class dictated the materials at hand, but not the struggle itself. Sleep was a victory never freely given, always earned through effort, adaptation, and compromise. Thus, when we imagine medieval nights, we should not see quiet slumber untouched by hardship, but a scene of humanity at its most persistent of fires tended. Beds layered, bodies gathered close, and rituals performed with care. The cold was never vanquished, yet people endured it with ingenuity, turning discomfort into habit, and habit into survival. Every dawn was proof that the battle, fought in silence each night, had been won once again. And so, as we close the story of these long, frosty nights and the resilience they demanded, let it remind us how much comfort we take for granted today. The medieval world may have been dark, cold, and unforgiving, but it was also a testament to human strength and adaptability, showing that even in the harshest of winters, people found ways to dream, to endure, and to rise with the morning. With that, may you find warmth in your own bed tonight, free from drafts, frost, and smoke, and may your sleep be deep, peaceful, and filled with dreams. Good night.